Hi, welcome to our presentation. My name's Eleanor Strathern, and I'm going to be introducing the notion of economic convergence, specifically the convergence hypothesis and how absolute convergence compares to conditional convergence. I'm going to start by introducing the theory, its history, and then a comparison between the two. We'll then go on in our presentation to analyse real-world examples and empirical data to understand if the theory of conditional and absolute convergence translates into real-world economics. So when we're referring to the convergence hypothesis, we're specifically referring to the idea that per capita incomes or output per worker across economies at the aggregate level will eventually converge over time to reach a similar level. Just a quick note, this specifically refers to macro convergence, which is slightly different to micro convergence. This is a really important topic in economics and also represents one of the largest controversies. So it's really important that it's understood not just in theory, but also in reality. At its core, the hypothesis is the idea that we expect aggregate incomes across economies to narrow over time as the difference between them gets smaller. As a result, low-income countries tend to have a much faster rate of growth than more advanced economies in order to catch up and converge. Higher growth in high-income or advanced economies tends to lead to faster growth than would otherwise be possible in less advanced economies. All these factors therefore point towards an international externality in economic growth. It's really important that this is understood because at the individual level, converging and increasing incomes, per capita incomes, leads to reduced poverty and increased human dignity, but also at the global level, large disparities can usually lead to increased international tensions and conflicts. So now that we've understood what convergence is, it's really important that we understand why many economists believe that it's happening or the reasonings behind the hypothesis. One crucial one is through the diffusion of technology, which is essentially the notion that poorer countries will benefit from more advanced economies developing and investing and producing this new technology, which they in turn share with them, which can boost the growth rates of these less advanced economies, allowing them to experience higher growth than the more advanced economies, or higher growth rates, than the more advanced economies, leading to convergence. This is a notion that's been around for a good couple of centuries. The idea was first propositioned by Hume, an economist in the 18th century, who came up with the notion that transferring technology through exporting manufacturing to lower wage economies offered these poorer economies the opportunity to experience higher growth rates. Once they then grew and began to converge with the more advanced economies, manufacturing would then be exported elsewhere to other low-wage economies, having left behind that shared technology, which effectively allowed, in turn, different countries to be brought up, experience the higher growth rates, and an overall convergence. This idea was then developed and cemented really by Veblen in 1915, who theorised that the transference of technology led to convergence, and being technologically backwards was therefore an advantage. This was then expanded by Georgis's theory of relative backwardness, who refers to the idea that opportunities in industrialization vary directly with the backwardness of a country. So a country is able to reap greater rewards through industrialization if it's more backwards, technologically, productively. However, it's really important that we also notice that Abramovitz points out that there's a necessary condition for this to occur. So the notion that sharing technology with another country will automatically allow for increases in productivity, increased output per worker, increased incomes per capita, and therefore higher growth rates than the more advanced economies and convergence can only happen on the condition that there's adequate social capability in these so-called backwards economies. By social capability, Abramovitz is referring to his idea that an economy must have an adequate entrepreneurial ability, the right management and technological staff, the right institutions such as banks, insurance companies, and judiciary systems, But he's also referring to other aspects such as the right cultural and familial attitudes towards work and wealth that allow them to accept this new technology that's been shared with them by the more advanced economies. Therefore, technological backwardness in less advanced economies will only be beneficial on the condition that there's adequate social capability, which is effectively an exogenous factor. And that's starting to highlight some of the specific characteristics necessary for convergence to occur, which will be expanded upon further later on in this presentation. Another of the reasonings behind the convergence hypothesis is the neoclassical growth model. So in 1848, economist Mill, in his book Principles of Political Economy, predicted that convergence would come from rich countries focusing on the distribution of wealth rather than trying to increase it individually. And this shift would actually be what would allow poorer countries to catch up and converge, with notions such as technological advancement simply acting just to postpone the stationary state of the economy. However, more recently, the Solow-Swan model demonstrates that when the determinants of steady-state income are similar across economies, convergence can be expected. It predicts absolute convergence under special conditions including identical savings rates, population growth, identical production functions. However, when these economies differ in these basic characteristics, the model predicts only conditional convergence. To a large extent, much of the neoclassical growth models are underpinned solely by conditional convergence because they don't stand on absolute convergence, because very specific factors need to be absolutely identical, which is very unrealistic. It implies conditional convergence because it postulates diminishing returns to capital, effectively. And when these certain characteristics are met, then the model can demonstrate how conditional rather than absolute convergence can occur. And one final significant reasoning behind the convergence hypothesis is through considering the role of globalization. Many recent studies have found links between international trade and convergence, suggesting that poorer countries should reduce trade barriers in order to catch up with the more advanced economies. And there's lots of data showing that globalization is correlated with convergence. However, it remains unclear how globalization actually leads to convergence, and therefore the theory in this area is somewhat lacking. However, it is argued that through the homogenization of the determinants of income at the steady state level across economies, this homogenization allowed through globalization might be what's helping to align the characteristics of economies, making them more similar, and therefore allowing this conditional convergence to happen more easily. Therefore, globalization acts to facilitate conditional convergence, and that might be where there is that correlation between convergence and globalization, and that's a theory behind why it might be happening. Okay, so just to quickly summarise, overall, convergence referred to the process where poorer countries grow faster than more advanced economies. Absolute convergence specifically dictates that in the long run, economies reach the same income per capita or common steady state level, irrelevant of their national characteristics such as capital-labour ratios or output per worker, and it's completely independent of the characteristics of them and the other countries. Alternatively, conditional convergence suggests that a country converges to its own steady state level, and poorer countries can only grow faster than rich countries and converge with them when specific characteristics are similar. Some of these include the institutions, the levels of openness, and the social capability. So I hope that's given a quick overview of the theory. This presentation is now going to explore how this theory translates into real-world examples and empirical data, so I'm going to pass on next to Heather. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ellie. As mentioned, economic convergence has long been associated with globalization, with wide recognition of the processes and effects of colonialism and the expansion of global trading system. There are well-known links of prosperity between the global north and south. As an industrial revolution began in the north, the global south became a preferred location for global production. Through this, global value chains gave opportunities for knowledge and technology to be shared between countries. And this brought about a global structural transformation. This was aided by trade liberalization, facilitated by information and communication, as mentioned. Now, assessing the Solo model from a theoretical standpoint, Mankell, Roma and Wheel in 1992 adjust the model to account for human capital accumulation and physical human capital. They found that once savings and population growth were more accurately accounted for, convergence was significantly closer to the rate that the Solo model predicts. The conclusion drawn from this was that economic growth convergence was not to be expected, but differing countries catching up and then levelling off to achieve different but steady rates of growth. Mankell, Roma and Wheel state their augmented model accounts for around 80% of the cross-country variation in income, which is considerably accurate given the inevitable imperfections in data collection for that. This demonstrates how through incorporating human capital, accumulation and physical capital, more precise predictions on convergence can be achieved, and shows how modifications to existing models can allow for more accurate growth predictions while focusing on exogenous factors. Now we're going to take a look at strategies of measuring growth convergence. And income growth has long been seen as a potential measure of quality of life. Kenny evidences this and links GDP per capita to other indicators of quality of life, demonstrating there's many other factors in consideration for economic growth convergence between countries. Kenny highlights that there's been an increased focus on wider indicators of well-being as opposed to just income growth, such as life expectancies, mortality rates, and literacy rates. This emphasises the importance of considering a country's economic objectives when looking at convergence of growth measures. The Human Development Index is an example of this used by Easterlin. Thus, convergence of economic measures gives little indicator of development successes and failures, even if countries are converging. So, economic growth and development is now understood as multidimensional. In considering measures of economic convergence, inequality and distribution of income are both indicators of development. Dollar attributes this increased discussion of inequality and poverty to globalization. Through assessing quality of life variables, Kenny was able to find correlations in growth between countries. Kenny concluded if global income statistics were collected differently, they would show evidence of convergence, while also explaining economic growth divergence between individual countries. So, as we have found, domestic and external factors influence convergence. This makes it oversimplistic to solely look at GDP per capita when considering convergence of growth measures, as countries' growth is dependent on these characteristics. Ricardo, Lent and Danny note economic convergence is not guaranteed, but strategic interventions in trade are a catalyst for economic growth. These include the competency of institutions, as discussed, and policy measures taken by state leaders. Trade liberalisation, deregulation and privatisation have all been pushed on the global south as a part of debt-related conditionality from IFIs and other world organisations. Yet globally, many countries have struggled to handle this, the taxes and redistribution in this era. Countries similarly have faced a vast array of different environmental challenges, increasingly so through climate change, which has also had an effect on growth rates in certain countries. Ricardo, Lant and Danny in 2005 found states with an ability to successfully control their borders and territory will be more likely to grow, and this again shows that more effective management of an economy leads to growth. And this all supports the arguments that convergence is not automatic, as Solo argues, and that poor countries may not automatically catch up, as conditional convergence suggests. In considering measuring economic convergence of countries, data collection methods matter. When discussing accuracy of data collection for economic growth per capita, Milanovic in 2002 analysed methods used to compare GDP growth per capita between countries. He highlighted that the methods used to calculate quantiles is key in ensuring accurate conclusions can be drawn. He found more accurate studies use survey data, as opposed to multiplying income shares by GDP per capita. Another point he emphasized was that household figures may not really display true per capita consumption, as earnings may be divided unevenly amongst the household. This is a key factor to consider when comparing data for different countries. And further on this, Milanovic in 2002 highlights how converging economic growth data may lead to rising inequality, which, as mentioned, has become a more widely discussed economic objective among countries. Kenny also highlights how potential issues in reliability of data, which could include sample sizes. How large are they? Are they representative of the population? And obviously, larger sample sizes would be preferred to increase accuracy and avoid skewed results. But it's also important to consider the population sizes of the countries you're comparing and with the sample sizes. And another factor is are the data points taken across the same amount of time, measured with the same time intervals. But all of these different things can make an effect in your results if you don't look at them when comparing economic growth. But now George is going to look at data from countries and assess trends in convergence through the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So studies have essentially shown that countries with similar initial conditions, such as GDP per capita, education levels, institution quality, tend to converge, both on their GDP indicators and other well-being indicators. So yeah, convergence, it is shown that it depends on specific characteristics. And even though selected developing countries, such as those in East Asia, have grown quickly, if poor countries are taken as a whole, many studies show that there is no systematic tendency for them to grow faster, at least until the most recent data. So there are many examples across different parts of the world and for different group of countries that they show this convergence. And we will discuss some of them, such as some specific EU countries, Asian tigers, and some countries in Latin America. So one of the most well-known examples of conditional convergence is a convergence that occurred in Europe decades after the Second World War. So essentially, countries with similar income levels, education, infrastructure at the start of this period experienced a significant convergence in terms of GDP per capita over time. For example, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which were among the poorest countries of the European Union at that time, experienced rapid growth and converged towards the average income levels of the EU by the 1990s. As you can see, there was some similar differences in the changes of GDP per capita for all of these countries which shared similar characteristics. Also, these three countries, as we can see here, they managed to reach the EU average. Let's say Spain, the 1970s, the GDP per capita was 50% of the EU average, and it reached 70% in 1990s. Another prominent example is the Asian tigers, who share many specific similarities for their policies and different other characteristics. So first, all these countries were followed an export-oriented development, which means that they pursued a strategy for export-oriented development, which focused on developing their manufacturing sectors and exporting goods to international markets, which allowed them to take advantage of the growing global demand for manufactured goods after 1960s. Yeah, they managed to earn foreign exchange to finance further economic development. There was also some government intervention with some relevant policies, promoted industrialization, such as import substitution and some technology transfer. These countries also shared some similarities in the high saving rates, and the investment was influenced by this high saving rates, and this means that they didn't need to get external debt, which was pretty significant for their development. Also, obviously, they did some investment in education, skill acquisition of their workforce. And finally, there was some relative political stability, which created these environments which were appealing for implementing long-term economic policies, and uh, which would disturb social, which essentially didn't disturb social unrest. Um, so yes, there's some data about the growth of the Asian tigers compared to some other countries, mainly developed ones. We see that their development was way higher than the average. And last, we will just compare some countries in Latin America. So we will essentially compare Chile and Costa Rica, which share some characteristics that is believed contribute in the faster development, as opposed to Brazil and Mexico, which didn't share these characteristics. So essentially, Chile and Costa Rica had some similar characteristics in education, infrastructure, their openness to trade, some specific macroeconomic policies, such as controlling inflation and managing public fund and public finance, which, as opposed to Brazil and Mexico, which had larger and more diverse economies, they faced challenges in terms of political instability, corruption, and some weak institutional frameworks, which hindered their development. So here is the GDP per capita growth in Chile, which starts after the implementation of democracy, early 1980s, and we see some fluctuations, but essentially they managed to reach a high figure of 16,000 US dollars GDP per capita. Costa Rica, same starting point, and a more healthy development, essentially with less fluctuations, but similarities as opposed to uh, Brazil, which essentially started at the same point, but they didn't manage to reach figures above 12,000, and after the financial crisis, there is a major decline. And Mexico as well, with more fluctuations and essentially lower figures. So yeah, these differences um, among these countries that depend on their characteristics. So Jake now will present some data in favor of unconditional convergence, um, which supports that developing countries as a whole have managed after some time, essentially after the 1990s, so in the most modern eras, to catch up.
Thank you, George, for presenting evidence of conditional convergence. So my name's Jake Graham Rosser, and I'm going to present the evidence of unconditional convergence. So as previously explained, unconditional convergence describes when poorer economies initially grow faster than richer economies as to converge to a similar level of economic growth. This is usually measured with GDP. However, it's also important to consider other indicators of well-being such as health and education, which are always also important to consider when we look at the standard of living within economies. Therefore, we can also show convergence between these factors. The first piece of evidence which I present is from a paper by Jones in 1997. It shows GDP per worker relative to the US for 121 different countries across the globe. So we calculate it relative to the US because at the years where this data is calculated, 1960 and 1988, the US had the highest GDP in the world. Therefore, it represents the richest economy. So by comparing other countries to this, we can understand if there's been convergence. So by looking at the graph, we can see that the majority of countries has shifted to a higher proportion of GDP relative to the US, so around from 0.16 to around 0.32, which means that a higher proportion of countries have increased their GDP relative to the US, meaning that they've got their economic growth to a closer level to the US, which gives evidence to economic unconditional convergence. The next piece of evidence which I present comes from a different source. This is from a paper by Geers in 2012. This gives a more general idea as to how unconditional convergence has occurred. So this groups economies into developing, emerging, and advanced. And we can see that developing, the growth rate of per capita GDP for developing countries begins below that of the advanced. However, by around 2000 and since then, the growth rate of developing economies has been higher than that of advanced economies, which shows that their GDPs have become more similar and will continue to converge until they reach a similar level, further presenting evidence of economic unconditional convergence. Here we look at data presented by Easterlin in a paper from 2000, where we look at more specific country data to understand examples of developing and developed economies which have seen this convergence occur. So if we look at data before the turning point, we can see that UK has the highest growth rate percentage at 0.4%, and they grew this by about 3 times until after the turning point to 1.3%. However, if we look at India and use this as an example of a developing economy, we can see that before the turning point, their growth rate was only at 0.1%. However, after the turning point, they grew this by 17 times to 1.7%, which is higher than that of the UK, meaning that their GDP has been growing at a greater level than the UK after the turning point, meaning they were able to catch up in terms of economic growth, and therefore again demonstrates convergence unconditionally. However, as previously explained, it's important to remember that GDP does not encompass all aspects of standard of living in economies, so we need to consider alternative indicators as well. Here we look at further data presented in the paper by Easterlin. This is about the years of life expectancy at birth. So we're looking at this data between more developed and less developed areas of the world, between a time frame of 1950 to 1955 to 1990 and 1995, and see how this has changed. So looking at the column on the right, we can see that the change in life expectancy at birth has been about 3 times more in the less developed areas, meaning that the overall level of life expectancy has managed to rise in the less developed areas to become closer and close the gap between that of the less developed areas and the more developed areas, showing another example of economic unconditional convergence between countries in the world. Another economic indicator which we can consider is the total fertility rate. A lower total fertility rate indicates economic well-being, as children have a better opportunity to go to school and can also experience better quality of education. Additionally, women can improve their role in society, as they can focus on their career and education rather than childcare. Looking at data from the same time frame, which is 1950 to 1955 to 1990 to 1995 in the Easterlin paper, we can see that the decline in total fertility rate in this time period is almost 3 times as big in less developed areas compared to more developed areas. This again conveys another example of economic convergence, as the less developed areas are getting closer to the more developed areas in terms of total fertility rate. The last economic indicator that we consider is adult literacy rate, which helps to determine the quality of education within an economy. Looking at a period between 1950 and 1995, between more developed areas of the world and less developed areas of the world, we can see that the change between these two time periods is 6% bigger in less developed areas than more developed areas. So there's been an increase 6 times bigger in the adult literacy rate in less developed areas. This means that the overall level of literacy amongst adults in the less developed areas has become closer to that of the more developed areas again, representing another instance of economic unconditional convergence in yet another indicator of economic well-being. So to bring everything together, given the theory presented by Eleanor and Heather and the evidence given by George and myself, we can conclude that there is evidence to support the theory of both conditional and unconditional convergence. Firstly, George has shown that within groups of countries with similar characteristics, such as the Asian tigers and the European Union, there has been converging economic growth where the countries within these groups have reached more similar levels of economic growth over time. Also, I have shown that overall, developing countries have caught up with developed countries in terms of not only economic growth, but also literacy rates, life expectancy, and also total fertility rate. An important question to ask ourselves is, will this trend continue? Well, Dervis in his report in 2012 predicted that by 2025, per capita incomes of emerging countries will get even closer to those of developed countries, and also that China will displace the US as the richest country in the world. Thank you for listening.